There are three key indicators that actually impact our economy and ultimately real estate. The first one is unemployment. The goal of the government is to have unemployment under 6%. Because under 6%, it's at a manageable level and the populace feels good about how the economy is going. Now, you can see here that other than in 2020, when we had that spike because of COVID, you have to go all the way back to 2014 to have unemployment above that 6% rate. Now, by the way, you can see that we've had historic lows going all the way back to 1990. You can see that 2022 and 2023, 3.6% unemployment. And basically what we had there was everybody who wanted a job had a job. So for all intents and purposes, we're fully employed. Now you can see that things have been trending up. 24, we bumped to 4%, and we're projecting this year to be 4.5%. Now, if we look at what's going on month by month, you can see here that we're now starting to slowly see that increase in unemployment. And in fact, the numbers just came out for the month of August, and they came in at 4.3%, which was right on target with where the economists were projecting. What we see here is unemployment versus job openings. You can see here the light blue line is unemployed people in millions, and the yellow line is job openings. So what you see here is that we had, for a period of time, pretty much from 2021 through to about now, where we actually had more jobs available than we had people to fill those jobs. What does that mean? Well, typically it means that salaries will go up because it's supply and demand. Employers want the best employees, and when there's a shortage of great employees, what do? They offer more money. And you can see now that we're on a trajectory where the number of unemployed people are actually going to start to exceed the number of job openings. And again, the last time that we really saw this was back after during the Great Recession back in 2009, which was where it was greatest. So we need to keep an eye on this unemployment number. Now, you can see here unemployment by state. In the West, in the Northwest specifically, Idaho is at 3.7% unemployment, so below the national average. Washington came in actually at 4.2% unemployment in June, which was at the time right at the national average. And you can see Oregon is a darker color, and that's because Oregon came in at 5% unemployment. And along with California and Nevada, those states are seeing a higher rate of unemployment in the current market. Now, the next key number we look at is GDP, and that's gross domestic product. And what you see here is the annual GDP numbers, and in 2024, we had growth of 2.8%. The number that the Fed and the government is looking for is an average rate of around 2%. If we have a gross domestic product growth of around 2%, what that means is that the economy is doing really well and everybody's on fire. You get over 2%, and it's basically champagne and cocaine. The market's humming until, of course, you see it get really high like we did back in 2021, where now it's on fire. By the way, by definition, the government has said that a recession is any two consecutive quarters with negative GDP growth. So this is the annual numbers. You can see we had negative growth in 2009. We had negative growth in 2020. Now, if we look at the quarterly, you see what happened here. So the first and second quarter of 2020, we had negative growth. Why? COVID, right? We locked the country down. We weren't producing as much. We weren't spending as much. We weren't importing as much. Then we had a massive comeback right after the country reopened. We had 2 quarters of negative growth in 2022, but the government said, that's not really a recession. Well, okay, it's your definition. Fair enough. Now, if we look at what's going on this year, though, first quarter, and these numbers get revised multiple times. You can see here that we're now currently a revised number of a negative 0.5% growth. And again, we have to dig a little deeper to actually understand what's going on here. The first quarter, what we saw was a massive influx of imports. By the way, one of the ways that they actually measure GDP is by looking at the number of imports versus the number of exports. The reason that we had a massive number of imports in the first quarter was a lot of retailers were actually looking to get ahead of the tariffs. that were being threatened. And so they imported extra product. And then we saw in the second quarter, those imports slow down because everybody had warehouses full of product. That's why you see our growth at 3.3%. So unfortunately, the GDP and the impacts of tariffs on our gross domestic product won't really show up until the third and fourth quarter, but we'll keep an eye on that. The third key metric is inflation. And of course, this is the one that we hear a lot of conversation around. And I would tell you, quite frankly, inflation is one of the greatest risks to a democratic society. And the reason for that is that when we see inflation go up at a very quick and high rate, what we see is there are those that have and those that have not. And those that have a very different experience in a highly inflationary market. So if you look over the last few years and you take the top 1% wealthiest people in this country, have they actually been harmed by high inflation? And the answer is no. I mean, they don't care that a dozen eggs cost $6. But what has happened for them is all of their assets have increased in value. So they've actually made more money disproportionately to the rest of the population. And in fact, that's why you saw the Fed react so quickly when we saw rates spike up just over 7%. In fact, we saw the rates go, the federal funds rate, which by the way is the rate that banks borrow money from each other, it's an overnight rate, went from 0 to between 5.25% and 5.5%. Now, once we saw that happen, the Fed raised the rate quickly, and then we saw the brakes go on inflation, and it started to drop dramatically. And now it's sort of gotten down into a range where it's being a little bit stubborn. And you can see here what's happening on a month-to-month basis. In July, we saw that in CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of inflation, actually stayed level at 2.7%. However, core CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index with energy and food stripped out. And the reason they do that, by the way, is because of the volatility. For example, if there's a hurricane in the Gulf, what happens to the price of gas? Well, it goes up. Why? Because refineries shut down and there is a limitation on supply and demand drives prices up. If there's a flood in the San Joaquin Valley in California, guess what? The price of produce goes up dramatically. So they strip those out to try and get a better feel for what's going on in the market. And you can see here that core CPI in July went up 3.1%, which was an increase from 2.9% back in June. Now, by the way, 40% of the calculation of this inflationary number, Consumer Price Index, was actually driven by housing cost. When they're measuring housing costs, they're not just measuring the cost of buying a house, right? So prices of houses, or the cost of the mortgage, right? The interest rate. It's also rents, which are a big part of that. So you can tell that we're actually still seeing the pressure of real estate, and the cost of owning or renting housing is driving inflation up.